The scent of peppermint gave it all away. Ruby stood tucked behind the long serving table in a ballroom shimmering with crystal light, her calloused hands gripping a tray of wine glasses, dressed in the black uniform of the catering company, whose shift she had picked up tonight like any other shift in her life. White lilies smothered every aisle. The tablecloths were the soft cream of fresh butter. A string quartet in the corner played something straining to sound expensive, and threading through all of it was that scent. Sharp and sweet, cool, wrung down to the bone. Vera had sucked on those same peppermints for 3 long years, at every Sunday dinner, beside every hospital bed, on the very day Ruby's father drew his last breath, and that woman clutched her hand and called her daughter. Tonight, not a soul in that room recognized her as anything but a waitress in a pressed black uniform. Ruby was not on the guest list. She had come because it was work they were paying her $60 to carry wine through the ceremony, and tonight those $60 mattered to her more than her pride, because back home, in a leaking rented room, a 7-year-old was burning with fever, waiting for her to bring medicine. Then the doors at the end of the hall swung open. Vera walked in, draped in a gown of purest white. 49 years old and dressed like a girl walking into her very first marriage, her veil trembling with every step, and there at the altar, waiting, stood Cole, the man who had slipped a ring onto Ruby's finger 5 months earlier, then looked her dead in the eye and told her she was too worn down, too ordinary, that he needed a woman who could lift him upward, not one who made him feel he was carrying dead weight. Cole never once glanced toward the serving tables. He had no idea she was standing there. Ruby watched in silence. The woman who had once taught her how to fold a napkin properly, how to sit up straight in a family that respected only those who never let a single crack show, watched her drift down the aisle toward the man who had promised her a whole life. She did not cry. She had no need to. That part she had finished months ago, alone in the dark, with the shirt he'd left behind still faintly holding the cologne she still could not bring herself to throw away. What she felt now was quieter than pain, and far, far colder. She set the tray of wine down upon the table slowly, without spilling so much as a single drop. When the officiant raised his voice to ask whether anyone objected to this union to speak now, or forever hold their peace, Ruby's calloused fingers tightened once around the silver rim of the tray, then she let go. Not yet, because there were things about the woman in that wedding gown that even Ruby did not yet know, and things about her late father, things she had believed her entire life, that had never once been true. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you can walk with us all the way to the ending. Ruby left the banquet hall before the ceremony was over, as quietly as she had arrived, slipping through the service entrance where the smell of leftover food and dishwater steam replaced the fragrance of lilies and wine. The shift manager counted 6 crumpled $10 bills into her hand, gave her a curt nod, then turned away to deal with something else, and she tucked the money into the inside pocket of her coat, close against her heart, as though she feared it might vanish into thin air if she let her guard down for even a second. Outside, the city had already soaked itself in the dampness of night. She walked 3 blocks to the bus stop because a taxi was a luxury that had no place in any calculation she could afford to make, and along the way she stopped at the pharmacy still glowing at the corner, bought a bottle of children's cough syrup and a pack of fever reducers, then counted every coin of her change beneath the cold white lights. The coat she wore had carried her through 4 winters. There was a patch on the left elbow that she had sewn herself with thread that didn't quite match, and she wore it with the quiet composure of someone who had long since stopped caring how other people looked at her. She had once possessed another life, or at least the promise of another life, but promises couldn't keep anyone warm through a November night. On the nearly empty bus, her phone began to vibrate inside her pocket. She knew the number before she even looked at the screen, the kind of number she had memorized the way a person memorized a scar, and she let it ring 3 full times before answering, only because silence could sometimes be harder to bear than the voice waiting on the other end. It was the hospital's debt collection department, a woman's voice trained to sound sympathetic, reminding her of the unpaid medical bills from the final months of her father's life, a sum she was still paying off little by little, month after month, like someone bailing water from a leaking boat while knowing she would never empty it. She said thank you. She said she understood. She said she would make arrangements. The words had worn so smooth upon her tongue that they no longer seemed to mean anything at all. Then she ended the call and rested her forehead against the cold window, watching the streetlights drift backward behind her, like a silent procession escorting something away, something she couldn't find a name for. Her rented room was on the third floor of an old building, at the far end of a hallway where the light bulb flickered as though it couldn't decide whether it was willing to stay lit. She unlocked the door as softly as she could, and the moment it opened a crack, a tiny voice floated out of the warm darkness. "Ruby, you're home." Posey sat up on the bed pushed against the wall, her hair tousled, her cheeks flushed from the warmth beneath the blankets, and she reached both arms toward Ruby in the way only a 7-year-old child could, the kind of gesture that could make an entire long day collapse and disappear in a single moment. Ruby set the medicine down, hurried out of her patched coat, then sat on the edge of the bed and let the little girl wrap her arms around her neck. "I waited and waited for you," Posey whispered into her shoulder, her voice still hoarse with fatigue. "I couldn't sleep until I knew you were home." Ruby smoothed the loose strands of hair away from her forehead, pressed the back of her hand against it, and felt relief move through her when she realized the fever had faded considerably since she had left. "I brought you some syrup," she said, her voice softening in a way no one else had heard from her all day. "1 spoonful, and then we'll go to sleep. By morning, you'll feel good as new." The little girl obediently opened her mouth and swallowed the spoonful of syrup, grimacing at the taste before breaking into a quiet giggle when Ruby pretended to make the same face. In that moment, the cramped room with its peeling paint and a window that wouldn't quite shut against the wind became the warmest place Ruby knew in all the world. She pulled the blanket up beneath Posey's chin, told her half of an invented story about a lost cat that found its way home, and remained there until the child's breathing grew even again, small and trusting as the ticking of an old clock. Only after Posey had fallen deeply asleep did Ruby rise and walk toward the tiny kitchen corner. She opened the refrigerator, stared inside for a long while, then closed it, and poured herself a cup of warm water in place of the dinner she had quietly surrendered to the child's tomorrow. She sat down on the only chair in the room beneath the weak yellow light, and for the first time since she had stepped out of that glittering banquet hall, she allowed herself to close her eyes for one long moment. She didn't permit herself to cry, because tears were a luxury no less extravagant than a taxi, and because morning would still come whether she wept or not. But there was something she didn't yet know on that night, as she sat silently keeping watch over the sleep of a child who shared none of her blood and counted the loose coins inside her coat pocket. She didn't know that the very night she believed marked the deepest end of all her losses was about to become the night when everything in her life began to turn in a direction no one could possibly have foreseen. 6 months before that night, everything in Ruby's life had still been intact, or at least she had believed it was, and sometimes that kind of belief could be more dangerous than the truth itself. A fine rain was falling that evening as she cleaned the small apartment she shared with Cole, putting away the dishes after dinner, while Cole's phone lay face down on the kitchen counter, where he had forgotten it in his hurry to step outside and take a work call. Ruby wasn't the kind of person who searched through someone else's belongings. She had never done such a thing during the 2 years she had been with him, because she had grown up believing that trust was the only thing a poor person could give away without it costing anything. But just as she reached for the cloth to wipe the counter, the phone screen lit up with a message, and the first 3 words struck her eyes before she could turn away. "Miss you so much," the message read, sent by someone whose name had been saved as a single letter, V. She stood there for a long time with the cleaning cloth still draped over her hand, not moving, not breathing, while the entire kitchen seemed to tilt beneath her feet like the deck of a ship that had just struck a hidden reef. When Cole came back inside, she didn't scream or shatter anything, because that wasn't who she was, and because some part of her was still clinging to the fragile hope that there might be an explanation capable of making those 3 words harmless. She questioned him calmly and directly, the same way she had always confronted everything in life, because that honesty was once the very thing he had claimed to love about her. But Cole couldn't even be bothered to lie convincingly. He set the phone down, released a long breath as though he were the one who had been exhausted, then told her that she was too worn down by hard work for the life he wanted to have. That being with her made him feel trapped inside a narrow future, with no way out. He needed someone who could lift him higher, he said, not someone who forced him to bend down every day. There's someone who understands me in a way you've never bothered to try to understand, he continued. And it was the word bothered that cut deeper than all the others, as though the love she had given him for 2 years had been nothing more than an assignment she had been too lazy to complete. She uncovered the rest of the truth the way someone traces a fire in the darkness, smelling the smoke first and only then seeing the flames. The name saved beneath the letter V didn't belong to a stranger. It was Vera, the woman who had entered the lives of Ruby and her father 15 years earlier, the woman who had meticulously shaped her into a proper lady, teaching her the rigid etiquette required when entering a room filled with people who looked at her as though she didn't belong there, how to smile without allowing even the smallest fracture to appear across her face. For all those years, Ruby had believed those lessons were gifts from a stepmother who had finally learned how to love her husband's daughter. Vera had been the person Ruby called on the night no one answered her father's hospital phone anymore. Ruby had sat beside her in those cold waiting rooms, had rested her head on Vera's shoulder and wept, had believed that even as the world collapsed around her, there was still at least one person who would remain. Now, standing in the kitchen with those 3 words repeating over and over inside her mind, she understood something so cold it made her shudder. Vera had never been teaching her. She had been studying her. Every gesture, every habit, every man who entered Ruby's life had been observed through the eyes of a hunter patiently waiting for the prey to step within range. And that man, as it turned out, was Cole. What wounded Ruby most that night wasn't losing Cole, because once the light had fallen upon him, he appeared so small and ordinary that she found herself wondering what she had loved for all those years. What brought her to her knees, alone in the bathroom with one of his shirts still carrying the scent of his shaving lotion, was the double betrayal arriving all at once from 2 people, one to whom she had intended to give her entire life, and one she had trusted as a mother. Some studies say that when a person is betrayed by someone who once played the role of a parent, the wound doesn't lie in the same place as the wound left by a broken love affair. It lies deeper, in the part of a human being that was always supposed to remain safest. And when both wounds strike at the same time, born from the same scheme, something inside a person doesn't simply break apart. It fractures, then seals itself back together in a different shape, harder, sharper, and far colder than before. Ruby didn't fall apart after that night. She became quiet, and within that silence, something began to take form. Something that didn't yet have a name, but already possessed a direction, like an underground current silently carving its path through stone. 6 months had passed since that night in the kitchen, and Ruby had learned to live with the new coldness inside her chest, the way a person learns to live with a bone that once broke and has since healed, yet still aches whenever the weather changes. She took on more night shifts at Marlowe's Diner, a late-night restaurant tucked into the corner of a street the city seemed to have forgotten, where the red neon sign promising that the place was open 24 hours had been missing one glowing stroke for so long that no one bothered to repair it anymore. At that lonely hour, the diner's customers were usually exhausted truck drivers, nurses coming off their shifts, and sleepless souls who had nowhere to go and no idea where they belonged. Ruby knew their rhythms by heart. She knew the weak coffee she poured for them, and the small coins they left behind as tips, every little piece gathered and saved. That night, the diner was quiet. There was only the faint clicking of the old ceiling fan and the scratchy voice of a country song drifting from the radio behind the counter, when the glass door swung inward and a current of cold night air swept through the room, carrying with it a kind of silence Ruby had never witnessed inside that diner before. The man who entered wasn't tall in any ostentatious way, yet there was something about the way he walked that made the entire room seem to hold its breath. He moved slowly and deliberately, as though the ground beneath his feet had never dared to resist him. He wore a dark coat cut with quiet precision. Nothing about him glittered, and he didn't need anything that glittered. His face held the composure of a man who had grown so accustomed to being feared that he no longer paid any attention to it. The first thing Ruby noticed wasn't the man himself, but the reaction of everyone around him. The shift manager, A heavy-set man named Sal, who never left his chair behind the counter for anyone, suddenly rose to his feet and wiped both hands against his apron, even though they weren't dirty. At the corner table, two men who had been halfway through their late-night meal quietly placed money on the table without waiting for change, then walked out with steps that were hurried, even as they tried to appear unhurried. Neither of them dared to look directly at the newcomer. Even the radio seemed to grow quieter, though no one had touched it. One step behind the man, silent as a carefully trained shadow, walked another man who was younger, broad-shouldered, and constantly sweeping his eyes across the room, with the vigilance of someone for whom observation had become a second instinct. He said nothing. He merely gave a slight nod toward the table beside the window, and the man in the dark coat went over and sat down without needing any further direction, as though the two of them shared a language that required no words. The younger man took the table beside him, positioned slightly behind, and at precisely the right angle to watch both the entrance and the older man at the same time. Ruby knew nothing about their world, yet even she could faintly sense that this man's presence was meant to protect the other. Later, she would learn that his name was Warren Cade. Much later, she would understand the price of placing trust in a shadow that only appeared loyal. But tonight, he was merely a silent man who ordered a cup of black coffee with a nod. Sal hurried toward Ruby, beads of sweat gathering across his forehead even though the diner wasn't warm, and whispered in a voice made hoarse by tension that she was to serve that table, serve it properly, ask no unnecessary questions, and do nothing that might displease the man. Ruby looked at him, unable to understand how a single customer could transform the entire diner in such a way, and within that lack of understanding was a strange kind of freedom, because she was the only person in the room who didn't know what she was supposed to fear. She picked up the coffee pot and her order pad, then walked toward the table beside the window with the calm, steady steps of a waitress who had already spent 6 hours standing on aching feet. She set a cup in front of the man in the dark coat without the slightest tremor in her hand. "Coffee? Or would you like something else, sir?" she asked, her voice even and honestly tired, neither flattering nor afraid. The man lifted his eyes to her, and for a brief moment something shifted within those gray eyes, a sudden flicker of attention, as though he had just heard a discordant note in a piece of music he knew by heart. He was accustomed to people stammering, shrinking before him, and avoiding his gaze. He wasn't accustomed to a woman looking directly at him, as though he were simply another human being in need of a hot cup of coffee on a cold night. And it was that, more than anything else, that made him look at her for a moment longer than necessary. The man in dark clothing remained in the diner for about half an hour, drinking his coffee slowly and ordering nothing else, occasionally exchanging a few brief words with Warren Cade, in a voice so low that Ruby could hear only the sound of it, not the words themselves. She continued moving between the tables and doing her work as though there were nothing unusual about the diner that night, even though she could still feel those gray eyes following her each time she passed. Near 1:00 in the morning, he placed a bill on the table, worth far more than the price of a single cup of coffee, didn't wait for change, then rose and walked toward the door, with Warren following one step behind him as usual. Ruby picked up the bill and meant to call after him so she could return the extra money, because she wasn't accustomed to accepting anything she hadn't earned. That was why she stepped outside the diner and into the dim parking lot beneath the only streetlight still burning, at the exact moment when everything broke loose. From the darkness between two silent parked trucks, 3 figures rushed forward, swift and quiet, and Ruby understood immediately, through an instinct that came before thought itself, that these men hadn't come to rob anyone. Warren reacted almost at the same moment, turning to place himself between the man in dark clothing and the attackers charging toward them. In the next few seconds, the parking lot dissolved into chaos, filled with rapid movements and sharp breaths, with the dull, heavy sounds of bodies colliding in the darkness, with human shapes grappling beneath the weak yellow light that was bright enough to reveal their outlines but not their faces. The man in dark clothing showed no sign of panic. He moved with the cold composure of someone who had found himself in situations like this far too many times before. But 3 against 2 was an unpleasant number, and Ruby saw one of the attackers break away and circle behind him, reaching inside his coat and drawing out something that caught a thin flash of cold metal beneath the streetlight. Most people would have frozen in a moment like that, or screamed, or run, and no one could have blamed them. But something inside Ruby, something forged during 6 months of learning not to panic in the face of terrible things, kept her from doing any of the three. Beside the diner door, leaning against the wall, stood the heavy metal cart she used every night to move cases of beer and boxes of dry goods. Without taking time to think, almost before she understood what she was doing, she shoved it with all her strength straight toward the man, creeping up behind the stranger. The heavy cart struck his legs with a hard, dry crack, throwing him off balance and sending him stumbling forward. The metal object flew from his hand and rolled beneath a parked truck. That single moment of confusion was enough to change everything, because the man in dark clothing and Warren weren't the kind of men who allowed an opportunity to pass unused. When the advantage suddenly shifted, the three attackers realized that the ambush they had believed would be effortless had failed, and they retreated into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the parking lot empty except for the thunder of Ruby's own heartbeat. She stood there with both hands still clamped around the handle of the cart, her breath coming hard and turning to mist in the cold air. The strange thing was that she didn't feel afraid, or perhaps the fear arrived later, delayed like a guest knocking on the door after the party had already ended. The man in dark clothing turned to look at her, and beneath that weak yellow light, his face carried an expression Warren, who had stood beside him for years, had rarely seen. It wasn't gratitude because men like him weren't accustomed to feeling grateful to anyone. It was naked surprise, almost curiosity, the look of a man who had just witnessed something that hadn't appeared in any of his calculations. "You should run," he said, his voice low and strangely calm after everything that had just happened, as though he were commenting on the weather rather than an ambush in the middle of the night. Ruby released the handle of the cart, straightened herself, and looked at him with eyes that were still shaken but never turned away. "Maybe," she replied, her voice roughened by the cold and by the adrenaline slowly draining from her body. "But I've never been very good at doing what I'm supposed to do." The man studied her for a long moment, with the expression of someone turning back to a page he had believed he had already finished reading. Then he gave a slight nod, a small gesture carrying something almost like recognition, before turning away and climbing into the black car, waiting at the curb. He left Ruby standing alone in the night with the uneasy feeling that she had just crossed through a doorway from which there could be no return. Ruby slept very little for the rest of that night, not because she was afraid of the men who had rushed out of the darkness, but because an unfamiliar feeling continued to follow her, the feeling of someone who had accidentally stepped through a doorway she hadn't even known existed and could no longer find the way back. The next morning, she rose early as usual, prepared breakfast for Posy, braided the little girl's tangled hair, and sent her off to school with a smile she had practiced often enough to make it look natural. Then she returned to Marlowe's diner for the morning shift, telling herself that what had happened the night before had merely been a random accident, an abnormal moment that would dissolve beneath the daylight like morning mist. But the moment she entered the diner, she sensed that something was different. Sal, the shift manager, stood behind the counter wearing the expression of a man who had just heard news that left him uncertain whether he ought to feel relieved or even more frightened. He pulled her into a corner and lowered his voice until she had to lean closer to hear him clearly. He told her in the whisper of someone speaking about something he was never supposed to know, that the three men who had caused the trouble the night before, along with the entire group behind them, the same group that had long been quietly fighting for influence around the Eastern Harbor, had disappeared. Not disappeared in the way people usually imagined when they heard terrifying stories. Sal hurried to add, as though trying to reassure himself, but in a way that was even more chilling. In the span of a single morning, all their business contracts at the harbor had been canceled. Doors that had always stood open to them had suddenly slammed shut. People who had once shaken their hands now pretended they had never known them, and the men themselves had quietly left the city during the night without leaving behind a single word. There had been no loud commotion, no spoken threats, and nothing anyone could point to as direct proof. An entire force that had once existed openly and without restraint had simply been erased from the city's map with absolute and meticulous precision. like a line of writing quietly rubbed from a page by an unseen hand. Ruby stood listening, and as she listened, she felt the coldness beneath her spine spread slowly through her entire body. It wasn't the cold of ordinary fear, but the cold that came with understanding. She remembered the man in dark clothing with the calm gray eyes, the way the entire room had held its breath when he entered, and the way Sal had begun to sweat even though the diner wasn't warm. Now every piece fell into place, forming a picture that made her shiver. The man she had calmly poured coffee for, the man she had pushed the supply cart forward to save, wasn't an ordinary traveler who had happened to attract the attention of dangerous men. He was someone whose single nod could force an entire power to pack up and leave the city without requiring him to raise his voice. The ruthlessness of a man like that didn't lie in the things he did loudly before the eyes of others. It lay in the terrifying stillness with which he made everything happen. Just as people didn't fear the sound of thunder as much as they feared the silent moment immediately before lightning struck. Ruby poured coffee for customers throughout that morning, with hands that trembled slightly, not because she believed the man would harm her, but because she understood that she had accidentally become involved in a world governed by rules she didn't understand. A world where gratitude and revenge were both carried out in silence. A world in which a poor waitress like her should never have appeared. She told herself that it was over, that the man had left and would never return to that shabby late-night diner, and that her life would settle back into its familiar course of exhausting shifts and scattered coins left as tips. Yet even as she repeated those things to herself, one part of her, the part that had grown sharper and more alert after everything she had endured, quietly understood that there were thresholds a person could never pretend not to have crossed once they had stepped beyond them, and that the final look the man had given her in the darkness wasn't the look of someone preparing to forget a face. What Ruby couldn't possibly have known as she stood behind the coffee counter, with her hands still trembling, telling herself that the man would never return, was that his appearance at Marlowe's diner the night before had never been an accident. Grant Kessler wasn't the kind of man who entered any place without a reason, and the shabby late-night diner on the corner of that forgotten street wasn't among the places a man like him visited for pleasure. He had gone there because he was following a name, or more precisely, the shadow of a name that had vanished from his world many years earlier. A man who had once possessed numbers and secrets powerful enough to shake the foundations upon which an entire network of influence had been built. That man, an accountant who had once worked deep within the world Grant ruled, had disappeared without a trace on a winter day many years ago, taking with him something Grant had spent a great deal of time and effort trying to recover without success, until a new lead, faint and uncertain, brought him to that street corner and to that diner. Grant had learned long ago that those who wanted to disappear most completely rarely hid in distant or glamorous places. Instead, they slipped into places so ordinary that no one ever bothered to look, neighborhoods from which the city had turned its face away, places where a person could live and die without anyone remembering. A late-night diner, a false name, a life carefully woven to appear utterly unremarkable. That was precisely the disguise an intelligent and desperate man would choose, and Grant's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through years in a world that never forgave mistakes, told him that he was drawing close to something. He hadn't found the man he was searching for that night, for reasons he would only understand much later, but he had found something else he had never anticipated, something that transformed what had seemed like a failed journey into the beginning of something even a calculating man like him couldn't have foreseen. The woman who had poured his coffee while looking at him without fear, the woman who had pushed the supply cart forward to save him, despite not knowing who he was, kept returning to his thoughts throughout the following day in a way that troubled him, because Grant Kessler wasn't a man who allowed unfamiliar faces to occupy space inside his mind. He had ordered someone to investigate her, an old habit of a man who never left anything to chance. And what came back to him was only a bleak and sorrowful portrait of a difficult life, a waitress working 2 shifts to repay a hospital debt, raising a young child, nothing remarkable, nothing that should have concerned a man like him, and yet one small detail in that report made him stop and read it again and again, a detail concerning her late father, a man who had died 3 years earlier after an illness, a man who had opened a late-night diner on that very street corner. The man's name, though it had been cleverly changed, had left behind a faint trace that Grant's sharp eyes couldn't overlook. As for Ruby, she knew nothing at all about the invisible threads beginning to wind themselves around her life. She carried only a vague uneasiness she couldn't explain, the feeling of someone standing in a dark room and knowing with absolute certainty that another person was there with her, even though she couldn't hear a single sound. That night, after settling Posey into sleep and sitting alone beside the window, as she looked down upon the empty street, Ruby believed she had just escaped from something, when in truth she was standing directly at its threshold. The name of the father she had buried 3 years earlier, the father she believed she had understood better than anyone else in the world, was quietly becoming the thread that bound her life to the gray-eyed man, in a way she would need a very long time, and would have to pay a very high price to understand. Grant Kessler returned, but not to the diner, and not at night. 3 days after the incident in the parking lot, a polished black car stopped in front of the old building where Ruby lived, and Warren Cade climbed all the way to the 3rd floor, knocking us on her door with the cold courtesy of a man accustomed to delivering orders that required no explanation. He left behind a white card bearing nothing but an address and a time, with no name and no other message. Ruby spent a long while considering whether she should go. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to stay far away from the world she had accidentally touched, but there was a stubborn curiosity inside her, and beyond that, the exhausted lack of choices belonging to a woman who had grown accustomed to moving forward even when the road ahead was swallowed in darkness. So she asked the kind-hearted woman next door to watch Posey for the evening, put on the most presentable clothes she owned, and went to the appointed place. It wasn't a luxurious restaurant or a gleaming office as she had imagined, but a renovated old building near the harbor, with exposed brick walls, no sign, and nothing ostentatious. That cold simplicity unsettled her more than any display of wealth could have done. Grant was seated behind a heavy wooden desk when she entered. He didn't rise or smile. He merely tilted his head toward the chair opposite him, with the air of a man accustomed to believing that his time was more valuable than anyone else's in the room. Ruby sat down, kept her back straight, rested her work-roughened hands in her lap, and made no effort to appear different from who she truly was, because she had learned that pretending was a luxury only people with something left to lose could afford. He studied her in silence for a long moment, with the gaze of a man assessing the value of an object, yet also with the expression of someone genuinely trying to understand something. Then he spoke, his voice low and concise, without a single unnecessary word. "I have a proposition for you," he said, "and I'll be direct because I believe you're the kind of person who would rather hear the truth plainly than have it dressed up. I need a wife. Not for the reasons men usually need wives, but because there are doors in my world that open only for a married man, and there are people who will sit down at the negotiating table only when they believe I have something to lose, just as they do. This is an arrangement, not a love story. You'll be compensated generously, your debt will disappear, and you'll never have to worry about money again." Ruby didn't answer at once, and in the silence that followed, she felt the weight of his offer settle upon her shoulders like a stone. She understood exactly where she stood, a poor waitress burdened by a bottomless debt and responsible for a child, while the man before her had just placed on the table the very thing she had never dared to dream of possessing. Another woman might have seized it immediately, bowed her head in gratitude, or tried to polish herself into someone worthy of such an unexpected gift. But Ruby lifted her chin and looked directly into his gray eyes, and instead of offering the safe version of the truth, the softened and agreeable version she had prepared on the way there, she chose to say what was most honest inside her. "You want to know why I would agree," she said, her voice calm but never weak. "It isn't because of the money, though I'd be lying if I said money didn't matter to me. It's because not long ago, I stood in a room and watched the two people I trusted most in this world take everything I had, and they did it because they believed I was too small to do anything about it. I haven't come here to take revenge on anyone, sir. I've come because I'm tired of being the person others believe they can step on without ever paying a price." That naked honesty fell into the room and remained there, and Ruby saw something change in Grant's face. It wasn't a smile, because he wasn't a man who smiled easily, but a new and sharper attention, as though he had just realized that the woman sitting before him wasn't the chess piece he had imagined, but something far less predictable. He was accustomed to people sitting in that chair and telling him whatever they believed he wanted to hear. He was accustomed to flattery and fear disguised with care, and it had been far too long since anyone had spoken the truth to him without sweetening it into something easier to swallow. "You're dangerously honest," he said after a while, his voice slow and measured, "or you're the cleverest person who has ever sat in that chair." "I haven't decided which." Ruby never looked away. "Both," she replied, usually both at the same time, and for the first time that evening, the corner of the gray-eyed man's mouth moved slightly, revealing something very close to respect for a woman who had dared to sit across from him as an equal instead of kneeling at his feet. Ruby didn't rush to accept the proposal, even though every calculation in her mind told her that it was the only sensible choice a person in her circumstances could make, because she had learned that agreements which sounded too generous all concealed a price that only became visible when it was already too late. She sat in silence for a while, considering everything, then told him that she had one condition, and the firm, unwavering way she spoke. Those words made Grant raise an eyebrow slightly, because he wasn't accustomed to the people sitting on the other side of his desk being the ones who set the terms. "I'm raising a child," she said, "a 7-year-old girl. She isn't my daughter by blood, not in the way people usually understand it, but she's the only family I have left in this world, and I'm the only family she has. Any agreement between you and me must include her. She'll live with me beneath your roof, and she'll be safe, cared for, and allowed to grow up without ever having to know about the world you and I are entering. If you can't guarantee that, then we have nothing more to discuss, and I'll stand up and leave right now." Grant looked at her, and for a moment something difficult to read passed across his normally guarded face. Because of everything he had imagined about this woman, he hadn't expected the first thing she demanded to be neither money nor protection for herself, but safety for a child who didn't share her blood. He had lived too long in a world where everyone who came to the negotiating table arrived intending to claim something for themselves, and a person who placed someone else's interests above her own had become almost foreign to him. "Agreed," he said, only one word, but the way he spoke it, without hesitation and without bargaining, carried the weight of a promise from a man whose promises were rare and therefore precious. "The girl will be safe," he added, "and nothing from my world will be permitted to touch her. That is something I can guarantee, and I don't say things I'm unable to make true." A few days later, Grant came to the rented room to, as he put it, inspect their present living arrangements before everything was settled, though Ruby suspected he also wanted to see with his own eyes the child he had just included in his promise. Posey was sitting on the floor amid a scattered pile of crayons and sheets covered in clumsy drawings when the imposing man entered, and instead of shrinking back or showing fear before the commanding presence that had once made an entire diner hold its breath, she merely lifted her wide eyes toward him with the undisguised curiosity of a child, the kind of curiosity possessed only by children who hadn't yet learned how to be afraid. "You're really tall," she said, as though she were announcing an important scientific fact. "You're even taller than our refrigerator." Then she held out a sheet of paper covered in uneven lines and asked whether the animal she had drawn looked more like a cat or a dog, with all the seriousness of someone awaiting a judgment upon which life itself depended. Grant Kessler, the man whose single nod could force an entire power to pack up and leave the city, the man who hadn't been unsettled by anyone or anything in many years, suddenly found himself standing there without knowing how to answer the momentous question of a 7-year-old girl. He bent down awkwardly to study the paper, his expensive coat looking entirely out of place against the worn floor, and the crayons rolling around his shoes. After considering it for far longer than the question deserved, he said that he believed it was a cat, a very brave cat. Posey cried out in triumph, turned toward Ruby, and announced that he had guessed correctly. In that moment, standing in the corner of the room and watching the most powerful man she had ever met become bewildered by a child's drawing of a cat, Ruby felt something stir softly inside her, something she had believed she had buried long ago, a small and gentle warmth that she hurried to hide away. She didn't yet dare to give it a name, but she couldn't bring herself to extinguish it either. Their wedding lasted only 11 minutes. And within that brevity was a kind of honesty that all the lilies and expensive string music of another wedding could never have possessed. There was no banquet hall glittering beneath crystal light, no veil trembling with every step, no orchestra straining to sound elegant, only a small room inside City Hall with walls painted a pale gray, a civil registrar who had presided over thousands of marriages until his voice had become as even and mechanical as a machine, and the washed-out light of day streaming through a tall window. Ruby wore a simple ivory dress she had chosen herself, not white, because white had become tied in her mind to another image she didn't wish to carry into this day. She stood there with steady hands, facing the man who was about to become her husband under a contract whose true nature they both understood. Their only chosen witness was Warren Cade, standing silently in one corner with his usual grave expression, while an older woman who worked at City Hall had been called in to serve as the second witness. Two strangers watching a vow they themselves couldn't know was real or false. When the registrar reached the part where he asked whether she agreed to bind her life to this man, Ruby answered, before he could even finish the question, a clean and decisive yes. She caught the faint movement at the corner of Grant's mouth, the closest thing to amusement she had ever seen from him, as though he appreciated that unadorned honesty more than any elaborate declaration of devotion. This wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction carried out cleanly and efficiently, the sort of transaction Grant had completed countless times in rooms that meant even less than this one. And yet, when he took her hand to place the ring upon her finger, something small happened that had no place in an arrangement as purely practical as theirs. His hand remained over hers for one beat longer than the moment required, only half a second, a span of time so slight that it could easily have gone unnoticed. But Ruby felt it. When she raised her eyes, she saw a fleeting hesitation in his gray gaze, one he himself might not even have realized was there. Neither of them mentioned it, but both of them knew it had happened. After the certificate had been signed, as they stepped into the empty corridor of City Hall, Grant stopped and turned toward her, with the solemn expression she was beginning to recognize, the look that warned her he was about to say something he wanted her to remember. "There's something you need to understand clearly from this moment forward," he said, his voice low and measured, "before you step fully into this life. From the moment you carry my name, you're no longer an unknown waitress no one bothers to notice. You become part of my world, and my world has enemies who have waited a very long time to find a weakness in me. Anyone who stands close to me becomes a target, and I won't lie to you by pretending it isn't dangerous, because I believe you deserve the truth more than empty reassurance. I'll protect you, and I'll protect the girl, with everything I have. But you need to enter this life with your eyes open, knowing exactly what it is, rather than closing them and hoping for the best." Ruby listened to the warning and nodded, because she had lived long enough to know that sweet promises were often hollow, while honest warnings were the things worth trusting. She realized that, in some strange way, this man treated her with greater honesty than anyone who had ever claimed to love her. She glanced toward Warren Cade, who stood waiting beside the door, the quiet man Grant trusted deeply enough to choose as a witness on this significant day. And she saw something solid in his silent loyalty, a source of stability within the uncertain world she had just entered. She couldn't have known that the very steadiness in which she placed her trust would one day become the sharpest blade driven into the backs of the people who had stood in that small room, or that Grant's warning about enemies waiting for a weakness would come true in a way that even he, with all his caution, had never imagined. The news traveled through social circles, built entirely upon rumors disguised as relationships, and before long the name Kessler began appearing beside Ruby's in whispered conversations over breakfast tables, belonging to families who had always prided themselves on knowing everything before everyone else. Cole heard the news the way a man always hears something capable of overturning the small world he believes he controls, and less than 2 weeks after the wedding, he appeared at a fundraising event Grant was attending with Ruby, dressed far more carefully than the occasion required, like someone desperate to prove that he still belonged, in a place where, in truth, he had never truly belonged at all. He found a way to approach Ruby while she stood alone near the edge of the room, and the moment he began to speak, she realized that the man standing before her was far smaller than the image she had once carried of him, as though distance and time had worn away everything she had once mistaken for charm. "What are you doing with a man like him?" Cole said, trying to sound calm, even though the tension beneath his voice was plain, his hands tightening and opening again, in the restless manner of someone who didn't know where to put them. "Do you know what kind of man he is, Ruby? Do you know what people are saying about you out there?" Ruby looked at him, and what surprised her most wasn't his anger, but the baseless certainty in his voice, the certainty of a man who still believed his opinion about her life carried any weight at all. She placed the glass of water in her hand upon a nearby table, slowly and without haste, then answered in a voice so calm that the calmness itself made him falter. "You think any of this has something to do with you," she said. "That may be the most honest thing you've ever revealed about yourself." Cole opened his mouth to answer, but no words came, and Ruby realized that she no longer felt the familiar pain whenever she thought of him. The ache that had once kept her awake through so many nights had cooled into an indifference that was almost merciful. "There was a time when you looked at me and decided I was too insignificant to be worth keeping," she continued, never raising her voice, preserving the same composure that made every word as sharp as a blade. "You were wrong, but not in the way you're thinking now. You weren't wrong because I suddenly became valuable by standing beside a wealthy man. You were wrong because I had always been valuable. You simply never possessed enough discernment to see it, and now it's too late for you to learn how." Each word fell between them like a cold stone, and Cole stood there as 3 or 4 different expressions crossed his face before settling into anger, because anger was always the easiest refuge for a man who had just been forced to confront the smallness within himself. "He's only using you," Cole blurted out, his voice stripped of the false calm he had worn at first. "A man like him is never sincere with anyone. He'll throw you away when he no longer needs you, and when that happens, you'll remember what I said." Ruby was about to answer, but she didn't need to, because another voice sounded from behind Cole, low and composed, carrying a weight that seemed to freeze the very air around them. "Are you finished?" Cole spun around and found Grant standing there, though he had no idea how long Grant had been present or how much he had heard. In a single instant, all the blood seemed to drain from Cole's face, the reaction of a man who had just realized that he had spoken words he never should have said in front of the one person who never should have heard them. Grant didn't move closer. He didn't raise his voice or do anything threatening in the usual sense. He simply stood there and looked at Cole with calm gray eyes, and that calmness was more frightening than any spoken threat could have been. "My wife and I still have several people to greet," Grant said evenly, as though he were discussing nothing more than a business schedule. "And I believe you've had sufficient time to say everything you needed to say." He extended his hand, and Ruby placed hers in it, not because she needed someone to protect her, but because she wanted to, and the difference between those two things was anything but small. As they turned away, leaving Cole standing amid the crowd with a glass of wine in his hand, and a smallness that everyone could now see, Grant inclined his head slightly toward her and spoke in a voice meant for her alone. "You didn't need me to intervene," he said. "You had already handled him before I had the chance to speak." And within those words, Ruby heard something she had never heard from any man in her life. Not pity, not possession, but an honest respect offered to an equal. The inevitable confrontation between Ruby and Vera came on an autumn evening at a charity gala attended by the most powerful figures in the city. The kind of event Vera regarded as her natural stage, a place where she moved through the crowd with a carefully polished smile and a honeyed voice capable of making the person before her forget that a cold calculation lay behind it. Vera entered the room with Cole at her side, both of them dressed as though they were still the center of a world that was slowly closing its doors to them, and it took her a moment to realize that the eyes in the room that night weren't turning toward her as they usually did, but toward another woman standing beside Grant Kessler at the far end of the room, a woman Vera had believed, not so long ago, that she had permanently driven from every board that mattered. The instant Vera realized it was Ruby, the smile on her lips stiffened for a fraction of a second. Only a fraction. But Ruby, who had spent an entire childhood learning to read the smallest changes in this woman's face, caught it. Vera recovered quickly, as she always did, and approached with her arms extended and her voice tuned to the perfect warmth for all the listening ears around them. "Ruby, darling," she called. "What a delightful surprise. I must say, you've risen quickly, marrying a man so much older than you." A man everyone knows is best avoided. People will talk, my dear, they already are. It was an attack skillfully disguised as concern, a blade wrapped in velvet, and the entire room grew subtly still as everyone waited to see how the younger woman would respond to a master of such games. But Ruby didn't blush, stammer, or allow even the smallest crack to appear on her face, because she had learned that composure from the very woman standing before her, and now she was about to turn it against the person who had taught it to her. "I know," Ruby replied, her voice so soft and calm that those standing nearby had to lean closer to hear her clearly. "People are talking, and I hear it's the most interesting thing this circle has witnessed in many years." A quiet ripple of laughter rose somewhere in the crowd and was quickly swallowed, and Ruby saw the corner of Vera's eye twitch, the nearly invisible reaction of someone who had just realized that the prey she believed she had tamed had grown claws. Vera refused to retreat, because retreat had never been part of her nature, and she lowered her voice, making it sweeter, softer, and more poisonous. "I'm only worried about you, darling," she said. "I'm afraid you're swimming in waters far deeper than you understand. This family, this world, it isn't as simple as it appears, and I wouldn't want to see you drown." Those were the last words Vera managed to speak while still holding the advantage, because Ruby then did something no one in the room expected. She set her glass of water down upon the table with deliberate calm, held Vera's gaze with her own steady eyes, then spoke in the same gentle voice one might use to discuss the weather, saying something that made the air around them seem to stop breathing. "I don't think what truly frightens you, Mother, is the possibility that I might drown. I think what frightens you is that I've learned to swim far better than you ever imagined, and that this time I know exactly which one of us is standing in deep water." The room fell silent, in the way a room falls silent only when something painfully true has just been spoken aloud, and within that silence, for the first time in all the 15 years Ruby had known her, Vera couldn't find an answer. The smile remained on her face, but it had become an empty mask, a layer of paint covering a wall that had just cracked, and everyone standing nearby, even those who didn't understand the full history between them, could sense that the balance of power between the two women had shifted decisively to one side. Grant stood several steps away and didn't intervene. He simply watched in silence with the expression of a man, witnessing something that pleased him deeply, and when Ruby turned back toward him, he said nothing, merely extended his hand. She placed hers in it, and they walked away together, leaving Vera in the center of the crowd with her smile frozen in place and Cole beside her, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "You just did something very few people would dare to do," Grant said quietly once they were beyond hearing. "You silenced that woman with her own weapon." Ruby didn't answer immediately, because what she felt wasn't the simple pleasure of victory, but something far more complicated, relief mingled with a fresh sense of caution, because she understood the woman she had just confronted better than anyone else. She knew that an animal cornered against a wall was far more dangerous than one roaming freely in pursuit of prey. Vera had lost this round, but Vera had never been the kind of person to accept defeat without overturning the entire board, and even in the sweetest moment of her triumph, Ruby could feel the shadow of what was coming stretching silently across the road ahead. After that evening, something changed in the way the two of them lived beneath the same roof, because the confrontation with Vera had transformed what they had both regarded as a simple arrangement into an alliance built around a shared purpose. They began spending their late evenings together, not in the manner of husband and wife, but as two people assembling a case. In Grant's study, with its exposed brick walls, they spread folders, old photographs, and scattered fragments of information across the heavy wooden desk, everything Warren and Grant's men had managed to uncover about Vera's past. Night after night, they sat across from one another, turning each page, fitting each broken piece into place, trying to reconstruct the true portrait of the woman who had slipped so carefully into both their lives. Ruby possessed a sharp eye for details others easily overlooked, a sensitivity refined through years of watching Vera from close range, and Grant soon realized that she wasn't sitting there merely to be guided by him. She was a genuine partner, someone who repeatedly noticed things that even his most experienced men had failed to see. One night, long after midnight, when both of them were exhausted from staring at endless stacks of paper, Ruby pointed to an old photograph and identified a small contradiction in the timeline Vera had constructed about her life. a gap of several years that no one had been able to explain. Grant straightened in his chair and looked at her with a new expression. "You saw that in only a few minutes," he said. "The very thing my people have overlooked for weeks." Ruby shrugged, rubbing her tired eyes, and replied that she had spent most of her life learning how to read that woman. Because when a person grew up beside a predator, she had no choice but to learn how to see the things it didn't want her seeing. Otherwise, she wouldn't survive. Her words left Grant silent for a while, and within that silence was an understanding that required no explanation, because he too had grown up in a world where vigilance wasn't a choice but a condition of survival. It was during one such night, while rain tapped softly against the window, and both of them leaned over the same file, that Grant revealed a small fragment of his own past, something he had never shared with anyone. He spoke of a younger brother in the careful voice of a man touching an old wound he had believed was covered in scar tissue. A brother he had failed to protect, a loss that had shaped him into the man he had become, cold, guarded, and determined to place control above everything else. He didn't tell her the entire story. He stopped at precisely the point where he could go no further, but even that was enough for Ruby to understand that the man sitting before her, the man the whole city feared, carried an emptiness inside his chest that neither power nor money could ever fill. She didn't ask for more or look at him with pity. She simply rested her hand upon the desk near his, not touching him, only close enough for him to know that she had heard him, and to a man like Grant, that respectful silence meant more than 1,000 words of comfort. Grant sat there in the warm darkness of the room and realized something about himself that took even him by surprise. For years, every person who entered his life had come to take something from him: his protection, his money, his name, his influence. Everyone wanted something, and each of them measured his value by what they could extract from him. But the woman sitting across from him, searching through stacks of documents in the middle of the night, with dark shadows beneath her eyes from lack of sleep, didn't want to take anything from him at all. She wanted to accomplish something with him, to stand beside him, and the difference between wanting something from a person and wanting something with that person was a distance Grant had traveled his entire life, without anyone ever helping him cross. "You are the first person," he said quietly, speaking almost more to himself than to her, "who has ever sat in that chair without trying to take something from me." Ruby lifted her eyes to him, and in that moment, surrounded by towers of documents, warm yellow light, and the sound of rain beyond the window, both of them understood that whatever was growing between them no longer belonged to any contract. That realization warmed them, and frightened them more deeply than any enemy waiting beyond those walls. If the feelings between Grant and Ruby grew during quiet, late nights spent over stacks of documents, then they blossomed beneath the light of day. And the surprising thing was that they blossomed through a 7-year-old child and an old bicycle. Posey found the bicycle in the mansion's storage shed, a forgotten old thing with faded blue paint and one completely flat tire, and she immediately fell in love with it with the absolute devotion only children can offer to lifeless objects. But the bicycle was broken. The chain had slipped from the gears, the handlebars wobbled, and one Saturday afternoon, the little girl went to find Grant wearing an expression of profound disappointment, and asked him whether anyone in the whole world could possibly repair a bicycle damaged so badly. Grant, who could have called anyone and had a brand new bicycle delivered to the door within an hour, did something instead that even he couldn't explain. He removed his expensive coat, rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, and sat down on the concrete courtyard beside the child to repair the bicycle with his own hands. For the rest of that afternoon, the man an entire city feared sat on the ground with grease-staining hands that were accustomed to clean surfaces and power, fitting the chain back into place, tightening the bolts, and inflating the collapsed tire, while Posey crouched beside him and directed his efforts with all the seriousness of a tiny foreman, occasionally handing him a tool she was holding upside down. Ruby stood in the doorway overlooking the courtyard with a dish towel still in one hand, and she felt her chest tighten at the sight, because there was something about watching such a powerful man respond with such patience to an innocent child's request that touched a place inside her she had struggled to keep closed. When the bicycle finally began to roll, Posey cried out with delight and pedaled in circles around the courtyard, her hair flying in the afternoon breeze. Grant rose and wiped his hands against his expensive trousers without giving it a thought, watching the little girl with an expression Ruby had never seen on his face before, a naked tenderness he hadn't managed to conceal in time. 2 weeks later, Posey's school held an end-of-term performance, and she had been given a small role in the class play, the part of a rabbit with exactly 3 lines, but to Posey it was the most important event in all 7 years of her life. Ruby hadn't dared to hope that Grant would attend, because she understood how busy and dangerous his world was. But when she entered the crowded elementary school auditorium, with its rows of plastic chairs and children's drawings covering the walls, she found that he was already there, sitting on a plastic chair so small that it looked almost comical beneath his frame, surrounded by ordinary parents waiting eagerly for the performance to begin, patient and silent, as though there were no other place in the world more important than this one that afternoon. When Posey stepped onto the stage in her rabbit costume, with the paper rabbit ears sitting slightly crooked on her head, and recited her 3 lines with all the solemn dignity a 7-year-old rabbit could possess, Ruby glanced sideways and caught Grant applauding, truly applauding, with a brief smile appearing across his usually guarded face. In that moment, she realized that this man had crossed a boundary even he himself might not yet have recognized. On the drive home that night, Posey fell asleep across the back seat, still clutching the papier-mâché rabbit ears tightly in her arms. Grant drove in silence for a long while before speaking, his voice low and soft as though he were afraid of waking the child. "I don't understand why," he said, "but during that entire afternoon, while I was sitting on that tiny plastic chair, I didn't think about anything belonging to the world outside." Ruby turned to look at him in the dim light, spilling through the windows from the passing street lamps, and she understood that he had just confessed something far greater than the words themselves seemed to carry. For a man who had spent his entire life remaining vigilant and in control, the ability to forget the outside world for even one afternoon was a gift he had never expected to receive. "She's very fond of you," Ruby said softly, and she was telling the truth, but they both understood that her words carried another meaning as well, something neither of them dared to speak aloud during that rare and peaceful night, while a child slept soundly in the back seat, and something that looked very much like a family was quietly taking shape before any of them had found a name for it. Ruby discovered it entirely by accident, in the way the deepest secrets are so often exposed, not through an investigation, but through a forgotten piece of paper. One morning, while she was clearing Grant's desk in search of a file they had been studying together about Vera, she accidentally turned over an unmarked envelope buried among the other documents, and inside was a financial statement showing regular sums of money being transferred each month to a place with a name she had never heard before, a name concealed so carefully behind layer upon layer of intermediary companies that only someone accustomed to reading documents like these could have followed the trail to its true destination. Curiosity drew her farther than she had intended to go, and when she pieced the fragments of information together, she realized that the quiet payments were being sent to a home for orphan children on the outskirts of the city. A small and unassuming place with no reputation at all, no plaque bearing the name of a benefactor, no mention in the newspapers, and no glittering fundraising event connected to it. The discovery left her stunned, because it didn't fit at all with the image of the man an entire city feared, the man whose single nod could force a whole organization to pack up and leave town. A man like Grant, had he wanted to cultivate a public image, could easily have placed his name upon a building or hosted lavish charity galas so the whole world would know of his generosity. But he had done the opposite. He had hidden the softest part of himself so thoroughly that even those closest to him had no idea it existed, and that secrecy told Ruby more about him than any report ever could. He wasn't doing it to receive recognition. He was doing it for some private reason, one deep enough that he didn't wish to share it with anyone in the world. She didn't pretend she had seen nothing, because pretending had never been her way, and that evening, when they were once again sitting together in the study, she gently mentioned the name she had found, not as an accusation, but as a door left open for him to step through if he chose. Grant remained silent for a very long time, and Ruby began to think that perhaps she had gone too far, that she had touched a place she should have left undisturbed. But then he set down the file in his hands and spoke in the careful voice of a man opening a door that had remained shut for so long that its hinges had rusted. "I had a younger brother," he said, and that was all he said during a silence so long that Ruby could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "He was many years younger than I was," Grant finally continued, "and I promised I would look after him, that I would keep him safe. It was the only thing I ever truly promised anyone when I was still young enough to believe that promises could always be kept. I didn't keep that promise." He said nothing more, and Ruby didn't ask, because she understood that what he had already revealed was more than he had ever permitted himself to share with anyone, and that the rest of the story was still a wound too deep to touch in a single evening. But it was enough for her to understand the meaning of that nameless children's home, to realize that every dollar quietly flowing there each month was his way of repaying a debt no one had demanded he repay, his way of trying to keep unfamiliar children safe as an act of atonement for the child he hadn't been able to protect. She looked at the man sitting before her, the man whose hands could make an entire city tremble, and whose heart carried an emptiness he had concealed for so many years, and she felt something inside her chest soften and grow warm in a way that was both gentle and frightening. Very softly, she told him that she believed his younger brother would be proud of what he was doing, and Grant lifted his eyes to her, a flicker of something very much like gratitude shining in their gray depths, a fragile light they both quietly cherished, neither of them knowing that the name brought back into the open that night would return again, carrying a truth none of them could possibly have foreseen. The truth arrived on a rainy afternoon, not through a confession, but through a file Warren placed upon the desk with the expression of a man who knew that what he had just brought would change everything. Grant had ordered his people to dig deeper into Vera's past, following the gap of several years in the timeline that Ruby herself had discovered, and what they found was a dark confirmation of Vera's true nature, proof that she was a deep-cover operative sent 15 years ago by a rival syndicate, specifically tasked with hunting down Ruby's father. He read the file in silence, his face growing more guarded with every page, and when Ruby entered the room and asked what was wrong, he lifted his eyes to her with an expression she had never seen before, one that held both shock and something close to pity, and that look made her heart sink before he had spoken a single word. "You should sit down," he said, and Ruby sat, resting both hands upon her knees as she prepared herself to hear something about Vera, because that was the only possibility she could imagine. But Grant's next words weren't about Vera. They were about her father, the man she had buried 3 years earlier, the father who had opened a shabby, late-night diner on the corner of a forgotten street and raised her on loose change and long nights of work. The father she had believed she understood better than anyone else in the world had never truly been the man she thought he was. "Your father's illness wasn't natural," Grant said slowly, his voice heavy with a truth he found difficult to speak aloud. "We already knew he was the accountant who fled with the syndicate's secrets, but this file proves that Vera didn't just stumble upon him. She was planted. For 15 years, she slowly poisoned his health, making it look like a gradual illness, desperate to break him and make him reveal where he hid the files before his heart gave out. He once worked deep inside one of those organizations, and then one day he disappeared, taking something with him, changing his name, erasing every trace of himself, and constructing a new life so ordinary that no one would ever bother to look at it twice." Ruby sat motionless as her entire childhood began rearranging itself inside her mind into a new order, one that was painful and cold. The late-night diner she had always believed was everything her father possessed, the name she carried, his secrecy, the way he never spoke about his past, the fact that no old friends ever came to visit, the absence of even a single photograph from his youth. Everything she had once interpreted as signs of a humble life now appeared beneath an entirely different light. They hadn't been signs of humility, they had been camouflage. Her whole life, the life she had believed was the truest thing she knew, had been constructed with meticulous care like a screen meant to conceal something her father had risked his life to keep hidden. "And Vera?" she asked, her voice hoarse, though she already knew the answer before Grant could speak, because every piece was now falling into its proper place with merciless precision. "Vera didn't enter your father's life by accident," Grant replied, his voice sinking lower beneath the weight of a truth even he found difficult to speak aloud. "She sought him out. She discovered where he was hiding, and she spent years working her way into his life, marrying him and becoming part of your family, all for one purpose, to gain access to whatever your father had hidden. The love you believed she felt for your father, the care you believed she gave to you, none of it was ever real. It was a siege that lasted 15 years, patient and cold, and you and your father were merely pieces in a game neither of you knew you were playing. Every word Grant spoke fell like a shard of ice, and Ruby felt the world around her tilt, because she realized that the woman who had taken Cole from her, the woman she had hated for 6 months because of one betrayal, had in truth betrayed her long before that, before Ruby had even been old enough to understand what betrayal meant. She remained there in silence for a long time, and Grant didn't disturb it. He simply allowed her to sit with that terrible truth and feel the full weight of it. But beneath the pain rising inside her chest, another question began to form, cold and sharp, a question she knew would haunt her until she found the answer. If Vera had spent 15 years hunting for whatever her father had hidden, and if her father was dead, then what did that mean? Had he truly died of illness, as Ruby had always believed, or was there something else she had never been told? And where was the thing he had risked his life to protect? The thing Vera had pursued for so many years. Now that the only person who knew its location had been lying beneath the earth for 3 years. The pain of what she had learned about her father hadn't yet begun to settle when another question started stirring inside Ruby's mind over the days that followed. A question that seemed small at first, no more than a grain of sand trapped inside a shoe, but one that grew more painful with every step she took. If her father was the man Grant had spent so many years searching for, and if the night he appeared at Marlowe's diner had been part of his pursuit of that accountant, then how could it possibly have been pure coincidence that only a few weeks later, he had proposed marriage to the daughter of the very man he was trying to find? She tried to push the thought away, telling herself that too many upheavals had made her suspicious of everything, that the man who had sat on the ground repairing Posey's bicycle and confessed to her about the younger brother he had lost couldn't possibly have been calculating how to use her from the very beginning. But the grain of sand refused to disappear, and one evening, when she could no longer endure it, she confronted him directly, because honesty was the only way she knew how to live, even when the answer might destroy her. "You knew who I was, didn't you?" she asked, standing in the middle of the study with her arms hanging at her sides, her voice steady, even though something fragile trembled beneath it. "From the very beginning, from that first night at the diner, you knew I was the daughter of the man you were searching for." Grant lifted his eyes from the file before him, and what tightened Ruby's heart wasn't a denial, but his silence, the half-second pause before he answered, the hesitation of a man deciding whether he should continue hiding the truth. And that brief silence told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. "Not that first night," he finally replied, his voice slow and careful. "But a few days later, when I had you investigated, I traced your father's name beneath the disguise. I knew then that you were the link I had spent years trying to find." The room seemed to fall silent, and within that silence, Ruby felt something inside her chest break apart, not loudly, but quietly and deeply, like a sheet of ice splitting from within. "So the marriage proposal," she said, and now her voices had begun to tremble, all of it, the contract, the marriage, bringing Posey and me beneath your roof. "It wasn't because you needed a wife to open certain doors in your world, the way you told me. It was because I was the daughter of the man who possessed the thing you wanted to find. You married me to keep me where you could watch me, so you could follow me and use me to reach it." Grant didn't deny it, and his refusal to deny it was crueler than any confession could have been, because it confirmed what she had feared most, that once again in her life, she had become a chess piece in the hands of someone she had begun to trust, that the warmth she had quietly cherished throughout the weeks they had shared might never have been real, but only part of a game she hadn't even known was being played with her. A laugh escaped her, brief and bitter, stripped of every trace of humor, the laugh of someone who had just encountered an irony too great for tears. "Do you know what the funniest part is?" she said. "My entire life, one person after another has looked at me and seen nothing but something they could take, something they could use. Cole looked at me and saw something to throw away when he no longer needed it. Vera looked at my father and saw a road leading to what she wanted. And you You looked at me and saw a link, a clue, a way to find the thing you had hunted for all those years. How foolish was I to begin believing that this time might be different. Every word she spoke was directed less at him than at herself. At the part of her that had dared to hope again, and that was what hurt most of all. After that night in the kitchen long ago, she had promised herself that she would never allow herself to become that vulnerable again. Yet she had done precisely that. She had lowered her defenses, and now she was paying the price for that weakness. Grant rose to his feet, and for the first time since she had known him, the man who always controlled everything appeared uncertain, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, or didn't know how to express something he himself hadn't yet fully understood within his own heart. Ruby, he said her name, and there was something in the way he spoke it that nearly made her stop. But she wouldn't allow herself to stop, because she had learned through blood and tears that once someone had betrayed your trust, everything they said afterward, no matter how sweetly spoken, could be nothing more than another trap. Don't, she said, her voice now restored to its familiar coldness, the coldness that had saved her once before and was rising around her again like a wall. I need time. Don't say anything to me right now. Then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Grant standing alone among the stacks of documents, with something upon his face that she might have seen if she had remained for even one more second. But she didn't remain, and so the two of them were left standing at opposite ends of a silence. Neither knew how to cross. The days that followed passed beneath a silence, entirely different from the warm silences they had once shared in the study after midnight. Ruby moved her belongings into the bedroom at the far end of the hallway, a small and quiet gesture that carried its full meaning, and Grant understood it without needing her to say a word. She continued with the ordinary rhythms of her days. She still prepared breakfast for Posy, braided the little girl's hair, and saw her off to school. She still sat down to dinner with Grant at the long table, because Posy didn't understand what was happening, and Ruby didn't want the child to feel the frost slowly spreading between the two adults. But once Posy had gone to sleep and the house had settled into silence, Ruby no longer came to the study. She no longer sat across from him among the stacks of documents, and the empty chair on the opposite side of that heavy wooden desk became a distance they both felt more clearly than any words could ever express. Grant wasn't accustomed to losing control, and now he found himself lost in a way he had never experienced throughout his entire life. He had faced the most dangerous enemies without blinking. He had made cold decisions capable of making other people tremble. He had controlled an intricate network of power with the precision of a master chess player. But he didn't know what to do with the silence of a woman who had turned away from him. He didn't know how to reclaim something he couldn't force, couldn't purchase, and couldn't command to return. He found himself standing beside the window in the deepest hours of the night, looking down upon the city he controlled, and realizing that all his power became meaningless before the closed door of a bedroom at the end of the hallway. Warren, who had stood beside him long enough to read the things Grant never said aloud, quietly asked him once what he intended to do about the situation. Grant answered only with a long silence, because for the first time in his life he had no answer. What Ruby didn't know, what Grant hadn't possessed the courage to tell her on the night she confronted him, was the true reason he had hidden the fact that he knew who she was from the beginning. At first, it was true that he had married her partly because she was the link to the thing he had been searching for. He couldn't deny that, and he wasn't the kind of man who deceived himself about his own motives. But at some point during the weeks and months they had shared, at a moment even he couldn't identify with certainty, everything had changed. Perhaps it had happened on the afternoon when he sat on the courtyard ground, repairing Posy's bicycle. Perhaps it had happened on the night. Ruby placed her hand upon the desk near his, not touching him, but close enough for him to know she had heard his pain. Perhaps it had happened because of the way she had looked directly at him from the very first night, as though he were simply an ordinary human being who deserved to be treated with kindness. Somewhere among all those moments, Ruby had ceased to be a link in his calculations and had become something he didn't dare to name. That was why he hadn't told her the truth, not because he intended to continue using her, but because he was afraid. He was afraid that once she learned how everything had begun, She would leave before he had the chance to prove that the beginning was no longer the truth of what they had become. It was a fear a man like Grant had never allowed himself to feel, the fear of losing another human being, and because he didn't understand how to live with it, he handled it in the most clumsy way possible, with silence and concealment, the very methods most certain to make him lose the person he was afraid of losing. Now, standing beside the window in the darkness, he understood the bitter irony of it all. The caution that had always protected him had become the thing that betrayed him. He had lost Ruby's trust not because of what he had done at the beginning, but because he hadn't been brave enough to tell her honestly how everything had changed. At the far end of the hallway, behind the closed door, Ruby also lay awake in the darkness, her heart caught in a struggle she didn't know how to resolve. On one side were all the reasons she should never trust him again, and on the other was the memory of a man sitting on a tiny plastic chair in an elementary school auditorium, applauding for a 7-year-old rabbit as though it were the most important thing in the world. Vera was far too seasoned a hunter not to recognize when the board was beginning to shift against her, and after the evening Ruby publicly humiliated her before the crowd, she quietly withdrew into the shadows to watch, assess, and recalculate every move, just as a cunning animal never rushes into battle when it finds itself at a disadvantage. She could feel something closing in around her, that doors which had always stood open were beginning to narrow, that the thing she had hunted for 15 years was slowly slipping beyond her reach, and a woman like Vera, when cornered, didn't shrink into herself. She became more dangerous than ever. She came to see Ruby one afternoon when she knew Grant was away, appearing at the mansion with the composure of someone who still believed she had the right to enter any place she pleased. And when Ruby opened the door and found the woman standing there, a cold current ran the length of her spine. Vera didn't raise her voice. Vera never raised her voice, because her truest threats had always been hidden inside her sweetest words. "You're playing a game whose rules you don't fully understand, darling," she said, stepping into the living room without waiting to be invited, her eyes sweeping across the space with the calculating gaze of someone measuring what she was about to lose and what she intended to reclaim. "I know you believe you defeated me at that party. I know you and that man have been digging through my past, but you should remember one thing, my dear. I've survived wagers far greater than you, against opponents far more formidable than you could ever be, and I've always been the one left standing at the end. You have a child to worry about. You have a new life you're trying desperately to hold on to. And I know exactly which strings must be pulled to bring the entire castle you're hiding inside crashing down in a single night. Don't force me to pull them." Ruby held her ground and didn't step back, telling Vera that she was no longer the little girl Vera had manipulated all those years ago. Yet even as she spoke those defiant words, some part of her sensed that Vera's warning wasn't the empty boasting of someone driven to desperation. It carried the cold confidence of a person who knew she possessed a card her opponent hadn't yet seen. And Ruby was right. What she couldn't have known, what even Grant, with all his caution, had never suspected, was that Vera hadn't come there empty-handed. Long before the night at the diner, before Ruby had ever entered Grant's world, Vera had quietly fastened a thread directly into the heart of that world, into someone Grant trusted without reservation, someone who had stood beside him for years, so silent and loyal that no one had ever thought to question that loyalty. Warren Cade, the quiet man who always stood one step behind Grant, who had served as the witness at his wedding, whom Ruby had looked upon and found reassuring, like a solid point of support within the uncertain world she had just entered. That very man had been bought by Vera years earlier, with money, with promises, and with an old resentment no one else knew existed. All that time, he had played the role of the faithful right hand, while quietly feeding Vera every fragment of information about Grant's movements, every secret, every weakness. He was the reason Vera always remained one step ahead, the reason she always knew which thread to pull, and now, as the game entered its final stage, the blade he had concealed for so many years was about to be drawn from its sheath. Vera left after planting the seed of fear she had come to sow, leaving Ruby standing alone in the living room with her heart pounding and an uneasiness she couldn't name, the feeling of someone who knew she had just been threatened but couldn't yet see the true shape of the danger. That evening, when Grant returned and Ruby told him about Vera's visit, He listened as his expression grew darker with every word. He told her that Vera never issued a threat without already having a plan behind it, and that if she was confident enough to walk directly into their home, it could only mean that she possessed a piece they had failed to see. That night, both of them could feel something approaching, a storm gathering beyond the horizon. But neither of them imagined that the storm would strike from inside the very walls they had believed were safest, from the one person to whom they had entrusted their lives. While going through all the documents about Vera again in light of everything they had recently learned, Ruby came across something she had overlooked during her earlier readings, a detail so small that it had once seemed meaningless. But now, when placed beside the other pieces, it suddenly revealed itself with such weight that she sank into the chair. It was a document connected to Posey, a collection of dates and names, and when Ruby followed them with the sharp eye she had developed through months of investigation, she uncovered a truth she had never once imagined she would need to question. Posey wasn't the biological child of Ruby's father and Vera. The little girl carried neither her father's blood nor Vera's. Vera had adopted the infant from an obscure orphanage, placed her inside the family beneath a story constructed with painstaking care, and turned her into part of the perfect disguise. And when Ruby's father passed away and the disguise was no longer useful, Vera had simply walked away, leaving the helpless 4-year-old toddler behind to starve. Knowing Ruby's soft heart would never allow her to abandon the child, Ruby remained seated for a long time, with the paper in her hand as an entire chain of small details she had never considered began rearranging themselves inside her mind. The way Vera had never truly looked at Posey with a mother's eyes, the way she could never remember the child's birthday, was never present for the small but meaningful moments of her childhood, and spoke of her as though she were something Vera possessed, rather than a human being she loved. Ruby had once believed it was merely the coldness of a woman without maternal instincts, but now she understood that it was something far colder than that. It was the indifference of someone who regarded a child as nothing more than a piece in a game, a prop in a performance, a document proving the truth of a story that had never been real. To Vera, Posey had never been a daughter. She had only been part of the disguise, and when that disguise was no longer useful, Vera had abandoned the little girl without looking back, the way someone might leave an empty suitcase behind at a forgotten railway station. What hurt Ruby most wasn't the truth about Posey's origins, but the thought that for all those years, the small human being she loved more than she loved herself had grown up beside a woman who had never truly seen her even once. Then, as Ruby sat in that quiet room with the paper in her hand, she suddenly understood something else, something that softened the pain rising inside her and replaced it with a warmth and certainty far stronger than before. Posey didn't share her blood. She never had. During all those years of caring for her, Ruby had always believed she did so out of responsibility toward a half-sister who shared their father, because of the bond of blood that connected them. But now she knew that no such bond existed and never had, and that realization revealed a truth so simple and profound that it brought a burning ache to her eyes. She hadn't loved Posey because the little girl was her blood. She loved her because she had chosen to love her, day after day. In every meal Ruby surrendered so the child could eat. In every night she remained awake watching over her sleep, and in every unfinished story she told until Posey drifted into dreams. And that, Ruby realized, was what truly created a family. It wasn't the blood flowing through their veins, or the names written upon a birth certificate. It was a choice repeated every day, the choice to remain, the choice to care, the choice to love another human being even when nothing required you to do so. Vera had brought Posey into the family as a chess piece and abandoned her when the game changed. But Ruby had gathered the child into her heart and made her family, and no truth about her origins, no document in the world, could shake that bond even slightly. Ruby wiped away the tear that had slipped down her cheek, not a tear of pain, but one born from the clarity that had just opened within her. Then she put the document away with care and determination, because she knew that even if the entire world around her collapsed, there was one thing she would never allow anyone to take from her, and that was the child sleeping peacefully in the room beyond, the child she had chosen and would continue choosing, again and again, for the rest of her life. Vera's final blow came on a moonless night, and it came through the one person no one had ever thought to suspect. Warren Cade approached Grant wearing the familiar urgency of a man carrying dangerous news, and said he had discovered where the thing Ruby's father had left behind was hidden, that it lay inside an abandoned warehouse in the Eastern Harbor District, and that they had to go there that very night before Vera's people could move it elsewhere. There was a haste in the way he spoke, an insistence that nearly swept Grant along despite the cautious instincts that had guided him throughout his life, and Ruby, who longed more than anyone to understand her father's secret, refused to let them go without her. It wasn't until the car rolled into the deserted harbor, passing between towering stacks of shipping containers that rose through the darkness like tombs made of steel, that Ruby caught Warren's eyes in the rearview mirror, cold and calculating in a way she had never seen in the quiet man before, and understood, far too late, that something was wrong. The warehouse was dark and empty when they entered, with no sign of the thing Warren had promised they would find, and the moment the heavy metal door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, Grant understood everything. He turned and pushed Ruby behind him with a reflex that came before thought, and figures began emerging from the darkness between the towering storage racks. In their midst, walking slowly and calmly as though she were entering her own living room, was Vera. "Thank you for coming, darling," she said to Ruby in that familiar honeyed voice, now chilling inside the hollow vastness of the warehouse. "You've always been so predictable. You'll go anywhere for the memory of your poor father." Beside Grant, Warren stepped backward toward Vera, and the betrayal revealed itself completely upon his face as the mask of loyalty he had worn for so many years finally fell away. "You stood beside me for 10 years, Grant said. His voice didn't rise, it sank lower, and within that composure was a pain only Ruby, standing close behind him, could feel. Warren didn't answer, or perhaps he never had the chance, because at that moment everything erupted at once. Vera's men rushed forward, and the dark warehouse dissolved into chaos, filled with swift movements and bodies grappling between the storage racks, with pounding footsteps echoing across the concrete floor and the crashing sounds of crates being knocked aside. Grant fought with the cold ferocity of a man protecting the most precious thing in his life, constantly positioning himself between Ruby and the men charging toward them, but the advantage of numbers wasn't on their side. In the faint light spilling through the high windows, Ruby saw one man circle in from the side, heading directly toward her from an angle Grant couldn't cover. She didn't freeze, just as she hadn't frozen on that night in the parking lot long ago, because the part of her that knew how to act when terrible things came had been forged through too many ordeals to fail her now. Beside her stood a tall stack of wooden pallets with a cargo rope stretched across them, and in a single instant, she seized the rope and pulled with all her strength, bringing the entire stack crashing down across the passageway. The man rushing toward her tripped and fell headlong amid the collapsing wood. That moment of chaos saved her, but it also caused Grant to turn and make certain she was safe, leaving an opening that one of the attackers didn't waste. Ruby saw him stop abruptly. She saw his solid body stagger, one hand rising to press hard against his side, while pain tightened his face before he forced it back down. "Grant," she shouted, and her voice rang through the warehouse not like the cry of a victim, but like a command. She rushed forward and caught him just as he began to sway. Yet, in the middle of what seemed to be their most desperate moment, the screech of vehicles braking and the thunder of running feet sounded from outside, because Grant, even after being drawn into Warren's trap, wasn't a man who could ever be deceived completely. Before entering the warehouse, he had managed to send a silent signal to the rest of his people, the ones whose loyalty was real. The warehouse doors burst open, flashlight beams swept wildly through the darkness, and the balance shifted within seconds. Vera's men were overwhelmed and driven against the walls. Ruby dropped to her knees beside Grant, supporting him with one hand while pressing the other firmly against the wound in his side, exactly as instinct told her to do. He looked up at her through the pain, one corner of his mouth lifting into a strained smile. "I thought you were still angry with me," he whispered, his voice breaking between breaths. "I'm still angry with you," she answered, tears already streaming down her face without her even realizing it. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you die in this place." And as the chaos slowly settled around them, amid the footsteps, sweeping lights, and shouted commands, the two of them held on to each other, and within that clasp, something was answered without either of them needing to speak another word. Grant's wound wasn't life-threatening, but it forced him to remain in bed and rest throughout the days that followed. And it was during that quiet stretch of time, while the two of them sat together in a room filled with sunlight, that the final truth Vera and Grant had spent so many years searching for at last began to reveal itself, and it did so in the most ironic way neither of them could ever have anticipated. They had searched the warehouse and found nothing. They had ordered Grant's people to dig through every corner of Ruby's father's past, yet they still couldn't discover where the secret had been hidden, and Grant had begun to wonder whether it had ever truly existed, or whether it was only a ghost that he and Vera had both spent all those years pursuing. Ruby was the one who accidentally touched upon the answer, as she sat beside his bed and reached into the old, worn handbag she had carried with her for so many years. The bag she had never replaced, even though its seams had torn in several places, simply because it was one of the few things her father had left behind for her. Inside the bag, in a hidden lining where she had always kept an old photograph of herself and her father from when she was a child, a photograph she had looked at thousands of times without ever thinking anything more of it, she suddenly noticed that the stiff backing behind the picture was slightly thicker than it should been, slightly harder, as though something had been concealed within it. Her hand stopped, and a strange sensation traveled along her spine, the feeling of someone standing at the threshold of something enormous, without yet understanding what it was. She gently separated the layers of cardboard, handling them as carefully as though she were reopening an old wound, and from between the two thin pieces of paper, a tiny memory card slipped free, an object small enough to disappear inside her palm, so ordinary that it had rested silently beside her heart for all those years without her ever suspecting it existed. Grant looked at the memory card in her hand, and an expression appeared across his face that blended astonishment with something close to admiration for the dead man. "For 15 years, he said softly, his voice filled with disbelief. "Vera searched every corner. She married your father, lived beneath his roof, and examined every inch of his life to find this. And all that time, it was right here, behind a photograph of a father and his daughter, inside the bag you carried with you every day." Ruby sat without moving, closing her fingers tightly around the memory card as a bitter yet beautiful truth slowly became clear inside her mind. Her father hadn't hidden the most precious and dangerous secret of his life in a bank vault, inside a concealed compartment, or in some distant place that was difficult to reach. He had hidden it in the safest place he could imagine, somewhere no predator, no matter how patient or cold, would ever think to search. He had hidden it beside his daughter, in the hands of the very child he had risked his entire life to protect. And in that moment, Ruby understood something even deeper than the secret itself. Throughout her life, person after person had looked at her and seen someone who possessed nothing, a poor waitress without property, power, or anything worthy of attention. Cole had looked at her and seen a burden worth discarding. Vera had looked at her and seen a small piece in the greater game she was playing. The entire world had passed by Ruby as though she were nothing more than a faint shadow standing at the roadside. Yet all those years, she, the woman everyone believed held nothing, had been carrying the most powerful piece on the entire board, the very thing the most influential people had shed blood and spent decades trying to find. Her father had known it. He had understood that no one would ever think to search the life of an ordinary young woman, and he had transformed the very insignificance the world assigned to her into the strongest shield, protecting his secret. "This is what killed my father, isn't it?" she asked, lifting her eyes toward Grant, her voice carrying a cold calmness that warned the tears would come later, once the shock had begun to fade. Grant didn't answer immediately, because he knew the answer to that question lay inside the memory card she was holding, and that once they opened it, there would be no way back, no way for Ruby to return to being the daughter who believed her father had died peacefully from an illness. "Are you certain you want to know?" he asked softly, just as he had once asked her a similar question about Vera in the early days. Ruby closed her fingers more tightly around the card, feeling its sharp edge press into the center of her palm. "I buried my father 3 years ago while believing a story that wasn't true," she replied, her voice firm even as her eyes began to fill with tears. "I would rather face the truth, no matter how painful it may be, than continue honoring a lie." With those words, she placed the memory card upon the table between them, preparing to open the final door leading to the complete truth about the father she had loved and, as it turned out, had never truly known. Inside the memory card, among files and figures powerful enough to bring down an entire criminal empire, among the evidence her father had quietly gathered over the years, concerning corrupt transactions, names, and streams of money flowing through the darkness, Ruby found another file, one that contained no numbers at all, but words, a letter her father had written to her and hidden beside the greatest secret of his life, waiting for the day she would finally discover it. She opened it with trembling hands, and through every line, the voice of her dead father rose inside her mind, gentle, weary, and filled with a love whose full depth she was only now beginning to understand. He wrote that if she was reading those words, it meant he was no longer alive, and that there were things he had hidden from her throughout her life, not because he hadn't trusted her, but because secrecy was the only way he had known to keep her safe. He wrote that he had known who Vera was from the very first day she entered his life. He had recognized her, known what she had been sent to find, and understood that the woman smiling at him was truly a predator dispatched to uncover the secret he was protecting. Then he had made the kind of choice only a father could make. He knew that if he drove Vera away, the organization behind her would simply send someone else, someone more ruthless, and the next time, they might not hesitate to use Ruby herself, his little girl, as leverage to force him to surrender what he had hidden. So instead of driving the beast away, he invited it into his home. He married Vera so he could always keep her within sight, so her search would remain trapped inside his own house, rather than spreading outward and placing his daughter in danger. For 15 years, he accepted a life beside a woman he knew had never loved him. He allowed the world to believe he was an ordinary man who had remarried a beautiful woman. He accepted the loss of his reputation and the truth of who he was. Also, he could build a living wall with his own body, between the predator and the daughter he loved more than life itself. By the time Ruby reached that part of the letter, she couldn't hold herself together any longer, and the tears she had suppressed for so many months finally broke free. Not tears of bitterness, but tears born from a sweetness so painful it tore through her heart. She realized that the childhood she had always believed was lonely and deprived had, in truth, been sheltered within a love so immense and silent that she had never been able to see its shape. Every time her father had seemed distant, every time he had closed himself off, every time she had felt an invisible space between them, all of it now appeared beneath the light of truth. It hadn't been indifference. It had been the price of a sacrifice no child could ever have understood. He ended the letter by apologizing for failing to give her a normal life, and by telling her that the secret he had left behind wasn't a burden, but a weapon, something he was placing in her hands so she could protect herself once he was no longer there, and that he trusted her to know when the right moment had come to use it. And she did use it, not through violence, and not through blood-soaked revenge, but through the very weapon her father had entrusted to her, the truth. The evidence on the memory card was delivered to the places where it needed to go, into the hands of people with authority whom even Vera couldn't bribe or intimidate, and the secret network she had served for so many years, the power that had sent her out to hunt, began collapsing from within beneath the weight of its own crimes. Vera wasn't exposed through a loud confrontation, but through the cold, undeniable revelation of documents. And the woman who had spent her life manipulating others and hiding in darkness was finally dragged into the light, where everything she had done stood naked before the eyes of the world. Her downfall came quietly and absolutely, in precisely the same way she had once made other people disappear, and within that bitter irony was a form of justice no sentence could ever equal. That night, after everything had finally settled, Ruby went to find Grant, who was sitting silently beside the window, looking down upon the city. "I read it all again," she said softly as she sat beside him, "and now I understand. I understand why you hid the truth from me. My father hid things from me throughout my life because he was afraid of losing me, and you did the same thing for the same reason. Both men in my life lied to me, not because you wanted to use me, but because you were both too frightened by the thought of having to lose me." Grant turned toward her, and in his gray eyes was a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I was wrong not to tell you the truth," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I thought silence was how I could protect what I treasured, but it became the surest way to lose it. Ruby placed her hand over his, this time truly touching him, with none of the hesitant distance that had remained between them before. Then from now on, she said, we stop hiding things from each other. And within that clasp of hands, beneath the stillness of a sleeping city, and in the aftermath of a storm that had finally passed, two people the world had misunderstood for so long found in each other a place where neither of them had to pretend anymore. That spring, on the corner of a street the city seemed to have forgotten, Ruby's father's old late-night diner opened its doors again, but it was no longer the shabby little place, with the broken neon sign from years before. Ruby used part of what she now possessed to restore it, preserving everything that belonged to the memory of her father, while breathing new life into the place. And she transformed it into somewhere anyone who was hungry and weary in the deepest hours of the night could enter and find a warm meal and a decent place to sit, whether or not they had money in their pockets. Exhausted truck drivers, homeless people shivering in the cold, and those whom life had pushed to the margins all found there the welcome Ruby herself had longed for throughout the loneliest years of her life, because she understood better than anyone what it felt like to be passed over by the entire world, as though one were nothing more than a faint shadow. She had decided that beneath her roof, no one would ever be made to feel that way again. Grant changed slowly, in the way people who had spent too many years living in darkness were forced to change, one step at a time, cautiously but with steady resolve. He began releasing the threads of power that had once bound him to the underworld he had ruled, handing things over, withdrawing, and closing one door after another, until the name that had once made an entire city hold its breath gradually became the name of a more ordinary man, a man who spent his afternoons repairing broken bicycles and sitting on tiny plastic chairs in elementary school auditoriums. The nameless children's home he had once supported in secret no longer had to remain hidden, and he allowed Ruby to care for it beside him. So the orphaned children living there could receive the thing his younger brother had never lived long enough to have, a safe place in which to grow up and a hand extended at precisely the moment it was needed. On weekend afternoons, the diner's kitchen overflowed with Posey's laughter. She had grown a little taller and a little more confident, and she stood on a stool beside Ruby, helping her knead dough and shape clumsy pastries into all kinds of strange forms, with white flour dusting both of her rosy cheeks. The fragrance that spread through the kitchen and filled the little diner each afternoon was no longer the sharp, cold sweetness of peppermint candy that had haunted Ruby since that night in the banquet hall years ago. It was the scent of bread fresh from the oven, warm, wholesome, and alive, the fragrance of a true home, of a life that had finally been rewritten in the way it should been all along. Ruby stood there, watching the child she had chosen as her family laugh beside her, then looking toward the man entering through the door, with both arms filled with bags of ingredients. And she understood that happiness wasn't something granted only to the fortunate. It was something built by those courageous enough never to trade their dignity for the promise of an easier peace. That was what her entire life had taught her, that the worth of a human being wasn't measured by how much money or power they possessed, nor by how other people saw them or chose to treat them, but by the person they chose to become after life had treated them cruelly. Ruby had been betrayed, belittled, and misunderstood by nearly everyone who should have loved her. She had every reason to become bitter and cold and close her heart forever. Instead, she chose kindness. She chose to open the doors of her home to people in need. She chose to love a child who shared none of her blood as though she were her own daughter. She chose to trust a man even when trust was the most dangerous thing she could possibly offer. It was that choice, made again and again with every passing day, that ultimately saved her. Not revenge and not victory. If Ruby's story has touched something deep within your heart, please leave a comment and share your honest feelings, because we always hope to hear the emotions that come from the deepest part of you as you reflect upon her journey. Please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that together we can continue listening to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. Thank you for staying with this story until its final words. And may everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and love filling every day that passes. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to meeting you again in the stories to come.